Okay, I think I have time for another video here. My last one was 20 minutes and probably should have been 8 minutes, so let me try to keep this briefer. I mentioned in a couple of my previous videos there's something called the YPI, Yearly Planning Instrument, that we go through in our Level 3 coaching process. Basically what the YPI is it's a yearly planning instrument where every skater you have, you're supposed to chart their year of training. Are you abandoning me? Am I talking too much? Piggy audience. So what you end up doing is you do a. I should get an example of this. I probably have one somewhere. You kind of, I mean, this is a terrible example of it, but you have this big graph paper with this chart of the 12 months of the year, and you, and it's the 12 months of the skating season, so it doesn't, you wouldn't go January to December for skaters. It would go, again, here's where you branch off. There's 3 different kind of seasons for skaters. There's the recreational star skate season, which basically goes September to May, or October to May for some clubs. There's the I'm going to call it semi-competitive, provincially competitive skater, which their main competition of the year is sectionals, which is in early November. So their season essentially ends in November and starts after that. So I guess that you could use the January to December model. And then you have actual competitive skaters who compete at the very least nationally year after year, if not internationally. And their main season goes in spring. They go to Grand Prix international events through March, April, May, June. Maybe not June, but they go through fall events. The Olympics are usually the end of fall too, or I'm not actually sure when the Olympics are, but I'm pretty sure they're after all the national events, and our national events is usually February, March, maybe January, that area. So their season ends in fall, starts in late spring, maybe early spring, and then goes through the year. And there's certain things you're supposed to do. Basically, how you're supposed to construct a skater year is you're supposed to start with their major events, which dates hopefully you know, at least roughly the dates you know. And I'm going to only do this for recreational skaters, for star skate skaters, because that's what most of my students are in Nova Scotia. So you would start the year, as I said, in September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. So I would say the season would go something like that, where the major competition of the year, I'm going to change colors this time, fancy, 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 April, May. I'd say their major competition of the year is provincials, which would be down there. After that, you'd have Atlantics, just somewhere around there. You'd have Rob McCall, somewhere around here. And you'd have Fall Skate, which is usually there. So that's where our 4 major competitions are. Really the 4 only competitions we have in Nova Scotia. It's a little bit of a weird skating season. So this would actually be basically the end of the year. The part of the yearly planning instrument is based on many years of studies on sports psychology, sports medicine, tactical, and various studies. The most recent study being the LTAD, long-term athlete development study, which was a very long study, which details at what age what kids learn what the best, which caused us to kind of restructure CanSkate at least, and quite a few other things. And all of this kind of goes into here. There's something called peaking, which is it's more easy to understand and control in like an endurance event like marathon running or triathlons or something like that. But essentially what happens is there are ways to control your performance level. long term, like months ahead of time. You have to do certain things in a certain order. You have to ramp up training and then ramp down training at certain times in order to peak at the right times. And when you have competitions going, if you have a competition going, you want your highest peak to be in your most important competition. Now, that may not be challenge. Maybe the challenge is to make it to challenge, or sorry, Atlantics. In this case, Atlantics. So maybe you want to peak at the qualifying event if you don't think you have a very good chance to get to Atlantics. If you think you have a pretty good chance to get, you wouldn't try to peak for the qualifier. You try to peak for Atlantics. Personally, most of my skaters aren't really in that position yet, so I'm trying to peak more for Atlantics. So when you're going performance levels along, you want the biggest peak. It's kind of like a heart monitor. You kind of want their best performance of the year to be at, this year, Rob McCall. It changes every year. I mean, it used to be provincial, so you want your biggest peak to be there. As I said, there are ways to manipulate and control your performance levels by doing certain things before leading up to an event. Either ramping up the exercises, the practice, the intensity of the practices, or ramping it down, and doing that in a certain order at a certain level. It's all very pretty scientifically exact and proven. So then the question becomes, what is the role of each of these competitions? Especially here. And a lot of people will do, like, for instance, they'll go to Skate Moncton and do an extra competition there. What's the point of these? Does it help with this peaking? I think a lot of skaters, especially younger skaters, and I'd say quite a lot of parents don't really understand the concept of a season, a competitive season, and that every competition leads to the next competition, and there's an arrangement and an organization and a plan going into effect for the whole season, that we're trying to peak for a certain competition. I believe a lot of people who aren't sports oriented and don't know about some of this deeper concept stuff believe that you can do the best you can at every competition. You can't. You can only do your best very sporadically, and usually once a year, usually a couple times a year. If you have enough space, you could probably peak again, arrange another high peak. But if you have a rapid succession of competitions, you can't skate your best in each competition. You have to decide which one you want to peak for, train to peak for, and which ones you want to kind of use for other purposes. This is a really important concept, because then you have to question, what is the point of these competitions, these early competitions? And essentially the entire thing is, as a coach, I think you have 3 questions you're trying to ask. Which competition are we trying to peak for? Which one's the most important? Let's say you think you're going to qualify, so we don't need to peak here. You don't need to peak at Rob McCall. You actually want to peak at, you want your biggest peak at Atlantics. See if you can do well at Atlantics. Let's say you've mastered provincial medals, provincial placements, and now you're trying to move on to Atlantic placements against New Brunswick and Newfoundland, which are much stronger than Nova Scotia. So you have to, as a coach, you have to plan your training, plan your whole season so that you're going to peak here. Not here, not here, that would be disastrous, and not here. You got to peak right here. And there's certain things you have to do to ramp up the training to get it to happen at the exact right spot. Parents don't know that. Skaters don't know that for the most part. Some of it might be intuitive, but the coaches actually know the details of how to properly manage and assess and control your peaks. That's the first question. My second question is, I consider all the competitions for a season information gathering on how to, again, how to control that peak, but how to make the whole season successful. Now, to make the whole season successful, occasionally you need to throw what I would call a throwaway competition, or an experimental competition, or a fact-finding competition, or an error-finding competition. And most coaches want their kids to do, I haven't taken a survey or anything, but I know most of the coaches that are pretty involved, pretty intense, pretty demanding in Nova Scotia want their kids to do 6 to 8 competitions a year. Now, my kids usually do 3, which is not really enough ingredients for me to make a really awesome skating season, but you make do with what you have. So number two for me is how to make a successful skating season. And if that means that one or two competitions have to be disasters in order to figure out things, how to get this peak to happen properly, how to get this execution to happen properly, then that's what you do. Then you don't worry about a certain competition, or you worry about specific tasks which might lead to an overall poor result in order to lead to better results further on in the season. That's the second concern. My third concern, which I don't know a lot of coaches that think a lot about this, but my third concern is how is this season going to impact next season? More long term. Is there something we can do this season that may not be good for this season, but may more positively impact next season? A perfect example of that is if we're trying to master a new jump, a higher level jump, and that jump is really not competition ready, but the kid has not really any technical problems, but has some mental problems, some psychological problems in doing that in the solo. You might force them to try that jump at every competition, knowing that it's going to go badly at some point, hoping they're going to break through and figure out how to do it. Maybe by the end of the season, maybe not. Maybe you're going to do a couple technical and psychological exercises after the season to make sure it's ready for the season after that. But you might actually knowingly, I'm not going to say sabotage, but knowingly sabotage the results at a competition or in the season to make the next season that much more successful. And again, most people should understand that. It's long-term gain versus short-term gain. One of the big problems in skating over the years is a lot of people will do only safe stuff in solos, and they don't progress fast enough because they're not taking enough risks. It's very important then there are people that take way too much risks and end up bombing every competition, or having a high percentage of bombing every competition, which is also not good. So there really has to be a balance between things, but there definitely are competitions that you have to willingly accept whatever results you get, and then reassess and reformat and re-strategize, and maybe come up with a whole new tactical approach to make the next competition better, and then better and better and better. Anyway, that's about it. That's essentially the point of the YPI. It has a lot more details than this. Once you find out where your competitions are, you know where you should start sharpen your skates in the places where you're not in desperate need. We'd also add test days in. We would add travel dates in. We would add, what else would we add in? I can't remember all the details, but you basically put everything, you put where should you have your music done by, where should you have your outfit done by, where should you have your choreography, where should we start having clean run-throughs, where should you start doing various different kinds of training, intensity training, where should you let off the intensity training, etc., etc. It helps a lot. Now the reality is that most coaches, myself included, I do this kind of mentally in my head for all my students. To actually sit down with students and parents and work through all this, I would probably do it for somebody who wanted to make a transition to an intensely competitive format versus a recreational format versus a star skate format. But for at least a couple years in a row, so they understand the process. But for recreational kids, again, the whole point is they don't want to skate off seasons. They don't want to put a ton of money and effort and time into training, off ice training, on ice training, lesson time. So this would be, it takes about maybe 4 to 5 hours to do a good YPI per skater. That's not an expense. That's not a physical doing the actual physical work of making the YPI is not an expense most skaters and parents would be willing to pay for. And probably that time and effort can be better spent on other things if you're in a star skate situation. So the point of this is just realize that, especially at the beginning of your competitive season, it's very experimental in the first competitions, and you're not supposed to be result-oriented, you're information-gathering oriented. You're trying to figure out a whole bunch of different information from a whole bunch of different sources and sides and approaches in order to make the next competition better and better and better and better. It's also, it's really complex, but I think I explained that reasonably well. Bye.